and welcome to Addicted to Murder. This is Courtney, licensed professional counselor with over a decade of experience.
And this is Trisha. And Courtney, I have a question for you that's not a real question.
Oh, okay.
But you said you knew who this person was. I don't. So, which of these seemingly outdated charges were laid against Amanda Knox in an Italian court in 2011?
Ooh.
Witchcraft, idolatry, Satanism, or having a child out of wedlock?
Oh. I'm gonna go with, I don't actually know that, but I'm gonna go with like witchcraft. I feel like that kind of fits the story a little.
It's true.
Okay.
A lawyer representing the man Knox claimed was responsible for the murder she was being charged with described her as an enchanting witch.
Right.
So I guess
She was accused of killing her roommate when she was a student in Italy.
Okay.
Like an exchange student.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know the story. Is that something you watched on some random true crime show or listened on a podcast?
It was in the news a lot when it was like happening when she was like appealing and trying to get back to the U.S. and everything because she was like a U.S. citizen who was being charged in Italy.
Got it. Because I was like, that name isn't very Italian.
No, she's not Italian. She's American.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you got it. You got the answer right.
Woo.
And now Courtney has a question for me.
I do.
And her too. But
yes. So my question is, what fictional character from a movie or TV show would you currently be in an argument or a fight with?
So it's kind of a toss-up. So from a movie, I went with Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know if you ever read that or watched it.
I'm familiar.
Yeah. I think Ken Kesey wrote it, and he's like, Eugenionian or something. And she was like the head nurse at the mental institution, and she was just awful. I would fight with her all the time. And then I would probably end up like Jack's character and be lobotomized.
Probably. Especially being a woman.
Right. And then for a show, the first thing that came to my mind was the smoking man in The X-Files. Because he is just devious and seems to be like manipulating everybody in all the directions of everything. And you're like, what the hell? And he's just always smoking those cigarettes. That's why they call it the smoking man.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't know. You don't watch The X-Files, right?
No.
Do you remember that? Do you remember that song? That one that's, there's a song that references the smoking man, the chicken to China, the Chinese chicken song.
Oh,
and
the
it's
1
like,
week.
Yes,
Yeah.
and he's like, I hope the smoking man's in this one. That's reference to him.
Oh.
And then there's another X-Files reference in that one song, the naughty song, the animals, I can't remember who sings it now. Bloodhound Gang.
Oh.
They're like, we can both, anyways. So yeah, that's who I picked, a movie and a show.
Okay.
How about you?
Well, I only picked one.
Right.
Not from a movie and a show. I picked one from a show. And it would be specifically Rory Gilmore.
I was just thinking you were going to do something Gilmore Girls.
Yes. But in the reboot seasons,
Yeah, she's so annoying.
where she is treating all the men in her life really terribly. She's not living up to her potential. And I just feel like all of her decisions are the wrong decisions. And so I'd probably be like, as like a bestie, arguing with her about how she's like throwing her life away.
Would you be more of a Lane or a Paris?
I think I'd be kind of a combination. I mean, I think of myself more as like a Lorelai.
Okay.
Right? Like kind, laid back, fun, but also like smart and responsible and yeah.
I think that in the reboot, Paris ended up being my favorite character.
Yeah, she was doing
so
great.
funny
Yeah.
in it. As soon as you said something, I was thinking Gilmore Girls. I was like, oh yeah, that's a show where there's. I would fight with Emily Gilmore all the time. I know that. At least in the big, maybe not the reboot.
Yes. Yeah, reboot Emily was great.
Yeah.
I really liked her.
Yeah, she kindly like chilled out.
Right.
Yeah. And it was sad that that actor died in real life.
Yeah, Victor. Or not Victor, but Richard Herman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was, did you ever watch the movie, the old vampire movie with Corey Feldman, Corey Haim? Oh, gosh, I'm forgetting what it's called, but he was the head vampire in it.
Oh, I did not watch
Lost
that.
Boys.
I've not watched it, but I've
It's
heard
really,
of it.
it's really old, but like, yeah, he kind of looked the same. Like he didn't really change much over the 30 years or 40 years since that, but he was a bad guy. And it was, so that's how I saw him before the Gilmore Girls. So it was kind of hard for me to like, switch it. But yeah, he was a great actor. So R.I.P.
Yeah.
Well, good question,
Okay.
Courtney.
Thanks.
And so we're back to part 2 of Ed Gein. And again, the book we're using is called Deviant by Harold Schechter. And Courtney, why don't you give us a recap?
All right, so last week we learned that Ed grew up with a hyper-religious mother who believed that anything remotely pleasurable was a sin, and a fairly useless alcoholic father. He grew up very close to his mother, who wanted to raise him kind of like a girl to avoid all the evil lust that men feel. He was an odd kid, but was generally seen as friendly and was good with like younger kids. But he struggled to find meaningful work as an adult.
Yeah.
And when he was in his, 20s and 30s, his father died from essentially alcoholism and dementia. His brother died in a brush fire under questionable circumstances. And then his mother died after a long illness.
I don't know if I said this last time, but I believe that her religion was Lutheranism. Not that that really matters, but I think I read that somewhere else in the book.
Okay. I mean, that is a very strict sect of Christianity.
Okay. Well, then it would track.
It would. It's kind of like they wanted to be Catholic but didn't want to follow the Pope.
Got it. Wanted more like of their own authority. Like,
Sort of, yeah.
Instead of a big man in Rome
Yes.
type of thing. Okay. So as she said, we left off with all of Ed's immediate family having died within just a few years of each other. And so now for the first time, Ed's completely on his own. He's in that big farmhouse, or actually the big property with the farmhouse on it. And he really started to decline hygienically. So he was not known for being a smart dresser or anything, but now he just really didn't seem to care what he looked like. He wasn't shaving. He wasn't bathing. He stopped taking care of the property. He ended up selling the cattle just to pay for his mother's funeral. So everything was just kind of overrun with weeds. He didn't really need much, though. Like Ed was a minimalist for sure. And to make ends meet, he kind of leased some land and he would do odd jobs here and there. And he got some sort of state pension for some reason. But, Courtney, do you think that Ed was in a depression, or do you think this may be some symptoms of possible future psychosis with what we're seeing right here?
I think it would make sense that Ed would struggle with depression after the death of his mother, since he idolized her so much, especially on the tail end of after losing his brother shortly before. And depression really could explain the deterioration in Ed's ability to take care of himself and his property. And also, just a note, without his mother there to essentially yell at him about his hygiene and appearance, it could be that this was just sort of Ed's natural state.
Very true, very true. By the early 1950s, Ed had become a recluse. He spent most of his time alone in the dark of his house. So back then, I don't know if he ended up getting electricity for his house, but I believe he had like oil lamps. So it was just dark in there all the time.
Yeah.
So he didn't go anywhere unless he had to. Well, unless it was to Mary Hogan's Tavern. Now, Eddie didn't have the same penchant for drinking that his dad did, probably because of how his mother taught him and how he saw his father's alcoholism, play out. But he would go several miles out of town to this tavern because he was fascinated by the proprietress, Mary Hogan herself. Now, Mary was a middle-aged, large woman, and she was German, but Eddie thought she looked kind of like his sainted mother. And he was possibly obsessed with this living, breathing rendition of Augusta. Unlike Augusta's prudish demeanor, Mary was a foul-mouthed woman with an impure past, possibly even a criminal past. She was rumored to have had mob connections and had had multiple divorces. So she was kind of the opposite of, his mother, who could do no wrong in personality, but she looked like him. So what do you think, Courtney?
I think to Ed, Mary Hogan was the perfect mix kind of good and evil. She resembled his mother, who was the epitome of beauty and goodness to him. But she also represented all of the lustful, brash, sinful things that Ed was taught by his mother were evil and forbidden. And so it would be, totally normal for him to be curious and want to know more about all the things that he was never allowed to experience.
That makes sense. So a few laters, the house, a few laters, a few years later, the house is described as basically that of a hoarder's house. I mean, the filthy part and all of that, as far as a hoarder's house goes, he wasn't bringing in a shit ton of stuff. He was just dirty and not throwing things out. So, he'd eat a can of beans for sustenance or maybe an occasional meal at someone's house if he was doing an odd job for them. But, he primarily just stayed at home in this filth. The house was filled with trash and old food scraps, boxes, other objects. All of the rooms were basically full of shit. Not poop, but crap. And you had to wade through it to get to the other side. So all of the rooms except for the ones that his mother had occupied. So those rooms had been left undisturbed since her death, and they were very neat and tidy. The furniture was nice. There were rugs in there, like her clothes. So during this time, Eddie is reading a lot. He's by himself. He doesn't have a whole lot to do. And he really liked to read the true crime and Pulp Fiction books, novels, magazines that many of the serial killers that we have studied seem to be so fond of. And it's one of the only things that he will actually talk to people about, murder and crime. Those things make him come out of his shell. So he's fascinated by it. However, he insists that he has an aversion to blood and he cannot even handle hunting large game because he does not like have to prepare the animal. He would hunt like squirrels or rabbits or whatever.
Right.
He did not find he did find another topic he was also into. And it was about these Nazi practices, like horrible things that they did during World War II. And he found a story about a woman who was accused of using the tattooed skin of her victims to make a book cover, lampshades. She also collected their skulls. He also enjoyed reading about real-life cannibalistic tribes as well as books about grave robbing. So, Courtney, Eddie has been pretty much alone for years now, and he seems to be getting lost in all sorts of lurid tales about horrible things done to humans by humans, and he's enjoying it. What are your thoughts about what's happening to Eddie during this time?
Well, there's a lot of research about the negative impact of isolation on the brain, and that long-term isolation in particular can contribute to psychotic symptoms. If you do any research about like solitary confinement in prisons and things like that. So we've got Ed, who was already dealing with the intense, teachings about good and evil from his mother, as well as grief of losing her and his, other family members. And he's now virtually alone in the world in this unclean, chaotic environment. And so the situation likely made Ed very susceptible to psychosis and for his interest in true crime and, the Nazi experiments to move beyond, interest that's based in realism and into delusional and obsessional thoughts. So if he's by himself just ingesting this material and ruminating on it.
Yeah, with no one to pull him out of this dreamland
Exactly.
kind of thing. Well, per the author of the book, Eddie, during this time, because of how much he was missing his mother, was starting to hear her voice. She would tell him to be good. He was also becoming angry with his neighbors. He was feeling as if most of them were rude to him, cheated him out of wages, and were generally disrespectful to him. Eddie says that he also felt like he was living in a dream. He at one point wanted to sell his home and move, but found that he just didn't have the energy to do so. Eddie was starting to see things as well. He would see buzzards in the forest, which isn't weird, but then he would see like one on every branch of every tree staring at him with red eyes. One time he was looking down at a pile of leaves and he saw several human faces that were grinning up at him, and they laughed at him as he ran away. He also smelled things that didn't appear to be there. What do you think, Courtney?
So at this time, Ed is displaying classic, what would be called positive symptoms of psychosis. potentially paranoid schizophrenia. He was experiencing auditory, visual, and olfactory hallucinations. He was paranoid about his neighbor's behavior and was experiencing a type of dissociation known as derealization. So, like that living in a dream feeling. You know, his sort of hoarding of garbage, his strange and unkempt dress, and lack of personal hygiene could also be related to the onset of like a first schizophrenic episode.
In schizophrenics, do they usually have like all three of these positive symptoms, or is that rare to have the hearing, the seeing, and the smelling?
I would say it's not rare.
Okay.
Auditory hallucinations are the most common, but visual, olfactory, and tactile hallucinations are all pretty common as well.
What would be a tactile hallucination?
That's like feeling like there are bugs crawling under your skin.
Okay.
So that like
Okay.
a touch sort of thing.
Okay. Well, it's about this time in Eddie's life that he starts to rob graves. It could be because he was still so despondent about losing his mother. He may have, in fact, attempted to take his mother out of her grave, but was unsuccessful. So perhaps others, those who were more recently interred and maybe not so far down in the earth, would suffice. So, Courtney, Eddie would indeed rob several graves over the next several years. What do you think he is trying to accomplish? What do we know psychologically about grave robbers in general? It's worth noting that later, when he is questioned about violating the corpses sexually, he was very adamant that he did not do such a thing. He said they were too smelly for him to do that.
So, historically, most people who steal dead bodies or rob graves are doing so for kind of one of three reasons. They are literally robbing the corpse of items of monetary value, like jewelry and things like that they might be buried with. They might be stealing a body for the fulfillment of necrophilia, or the bodies are being used for like medical or scientific experiments. I think Ed falls into the last category. He was so fascinated by the medical experiments that the Nazis carried out. I think it's most likely he was using the bodies he stole for kind of his own type of experimentation.
Okay. I think that is kind of what ends up happening. Some different motivation besides just the experimental, but yes. There were several unsolved missing person cases in Wisconsin during this time, and one of those women who disappeared was Mary Hogan, so the body bar owner that Eddie was so fascinated with. On December 8th, 1954, a local walked into her tavern and noticed a large pool of blood on the floor. And when investigators came to the scene, they found a shell casing, like a gun shell casing, on the floor. And it was just clear that Mary was a victim of a crime. And it appeared that the body, or a body, had been dragged through the blood. And the blood trail ended in the parking lot, indicating that Mary had been taken somewhere in a car or some sort of device. What do you think, Courtney? Did Eddie finally go all the way with Mary Hogan?
I mean, I think it's likely that Eddie did kill Mary. It could be that with his mother's teachings in his head, along with his intensifying psychotic symptoms, he may have believed that the only way to fully experience her, so to speak, was if she was dead.
Fully experience his mother or fully experience Mary?
Mary.
Okay. Eddie made a comment to a townsperson who was teasing him about how much time he had spent staring at Mary. Per the book, Elmo Ueek, I don't think I said that right, but said, quote, "If you had spent more time courting Mary, she'd be cooking for you instead of being missing." To which Eddie responded, quote, "She's not missing. She's down at the house now." Well, Elmo didn't think anything of this because Ed was kind of weird. And it wasn't until later on that he realized that Ed may have actually been telling the truth with that statement. What do you think?
I mean, we know that serial killers often subconsciously want to confess and have people know about their crimes.
Right.
So, there it is.
Yeah. By this time, Eddie was definitely getting the reputation around town as getting more and more weird. They called him a weirdo, quote, unquote. He was the one that little kids might tease others about. So, in fact, like, there were rumors around that you could see shrunken heads inside of Ed's house if you looked in just right. So, like, you know, little kids being like, "Oh, no, you got to go to Crazy Eddie's house," kind of like that kind of thing.
I dare you.
Yeah, that kind of thing. One such person claimed that Eddie brought out 2 human heads to show him. Their skin was leathery and their hair was long and matted. Ed said they came from a cousin who sent them to him from the South Seas. November 16th, 1957 is a turning point in Ed Gein's story. So it's hunting season, and most of the men are out of town hunting deer. But not Ed. He doesn't like blood, remember, or big game. So he instead takes himself to the Warden's. It's a department store in town, which is being run that day by Mrs. Warden, a woman whom Eddie has also likened to his mother. So she's a little bit older, you know. Mm-hmm. Apparently, he had been hanging out there a lot lately, even asking Mrs. Warden to go roller skating with him. This day, however, Ed had something much more sinister in mind. At some time between 8:45 and 9:30 in the morning, the Warden's truck was seen leaving the store by a neighboring business. So nothing was really weird about that. What was weird, though, was that the lights were left on, which made no sense if they were going to be closed for the weekend. And when Mrs. Morton's son came back from hunting, he checked on the store, and he was alarmed to see that the cash register was missing, and the floor had like blood-colored stuff on it. When he became convinced that something had happened to his mother, he knew that it was Eddie Gein, who had done something to his mother. So, Courtney, I guess the weird little man wasn't as harmless seeming to everyone in Plainfield, because that's sort of like where his mind went right away.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly his behavior was raising some red flags.
Yeah. Well, and we also learned that he explained to the police that Ed had been hanging out there a lot lately. He knew that he tried to get his mom to go roller skating. He also apparently asked her to go to the movie or to go dancing. And he had come by the day before and casually asked Frank, Mrs. Morton's son, if he was going to be out hunting the next day.
Ah.
Yep. Also, he had found a sales receipt written on the day of his mother's disappearance for some antifreeze sold to Mr. Edward Gein. So suffice to say, the police went over to Ed's house to question him. The town sheriff's name was Arthur Schley, and he was a little nervous about this murder investigation. I mean, he was only 32. He was new to the job. And he and his team of investigators entered Ed's house from the only unlocked door. And it was dark, no lights there. They looked around with their flashlights. And as Arthur was wading through all the debris in the home, he felt something touch his back. And when he turned around, he saw a large white dead carcass hanging by its feet from the ceiling. So the front of the carcass had been split and disemboweled to the point that you could see through to the other side. Like a big hole. The head was missing. Per the book, quote, the body had been butchered like a heifer or dressed out deer, only it wasn't an animal. It was the body of a human being, an adult woman, Bernice Warden's body. What do you think, Courtney?
I think that as disturbing as the idea is, the fact that Ed was treating Bernice's body like it was an animal carcass is evidence that his intention was more kind of like experimental as opposed to sexual or sadistic. I mean, it would be quite shocking for a young, new deputy or detective to walk in and see that, though.
Right. So officers and forensic teams, led by Police Captain Schechter, were now arriving on the scene. And these were people that had plenty of experience with murder investigation, but even they, with all of their experience, were not prepared to see the body of Mrs. Warden. They started to search the house and were exposed to how far down Gein had really gone. The house was disgusting, a shambles, stuff was littered everywhere. It was dark, dank, and just horribly depressing. And it probably smelt weird too, I'm sure. It was unlivable, uninhabitable. Besides the rooms that Ed had left for his mother, the house was basically a condemned space. And this is where the police got to start their search. And they were thrilled, I'm sure. So they found a shelf full of nasty dentures, chewing gum-filled coffee cans, and there was a wash basin full of sand. So this is just some of the weird shit he had. Not the illegal shit, but weird shit. So, Courtney, if Ed has some sort of psychosis or schizophrenia, does this state of the house surprise you?
No, it doesn't. Based on his actions so far, coupled with a likely schizophrenia diagnosis, I'd say, the state of his home is not surprising. his brain was not functioning in any sort of organized or logical fashion, and his surroundings clearly reflected that.
All right. So I'm going to go over some of the stuff they found. Trigger warning. It's not for the faint of heart, light of heart, whatever.
Faint of heart.
Is that?
Yes.
Okay. For
Yes.
some reason that just sounded wrong. Okay. One officer picked up what he thought was a funny looking bowl that you like ate from, but it turns out it was the top of a skull that Ed had fashioned into a bowl. Then they started to find all kinds of skull items. Some just the skull caps, but others were full skulls, and they just started to find them all over the place. A kitchen chair that stood out from the others did so because upon inspection, the woven bottom where you sat was replaced by human skin strips. Underneath those skin strips were pieces of fat. The investigators would eventually find the full 4 set of these chairs that were like that. Mm-hmm. More items that involved pieces of human bodies were uncovered. Things like a lampshade made of stretched skin and a wastebasket, a bracelet, a knife sheath, and something called a tom-tom, which I believe is a little hand drum. Further down the line, they would discover a belt that incorporated several human nipples and a shade pole that was fashioned from human lips. One of the investors picked up an old shoebox and discovered a large hoard of female genitals. What that means was that there were 9 vulvas in the box. They were shriveled with age and dry also, but some had been painted with silver paint and one sported a ribbon. The newest to the collection of this, which was not just a vulva, but it was the vulva and the anus, had been sprinkled with salt. You could see the salt crystals in the darkness. Another box contained several noses. A oatmeal container had pieces of a human head. Ed had also been making clothing, seemingly for himself, as many pairs of leggings made from skin were found, and a torso of a victim had been fashioned into like a corset or vest that Ed could wear. Then they discovered the masks. These, quote, masks were actually human faces removed or peeled from the skulls of women. There were 9 recovered, hair still attached, ratty or matted. The eyes were gone, leaving holes to see through when Ed decided to put one on. Some of the masks, perhaps the oldest of the group, were dry and looked almost mummified, but others, perhaps through his experimentation, seemed better kept. He may have treated them with some kind of preservative or oil. Some still wore the makeup they had been last wearing prior to Ed's handiwork, and apparently the people who knew the victims could tell who they were by looking at their masks. These masks, which were kept on his wall and stuffed with paper, perhaps to keep their shape, were thought to be the shrunken heads that people had seen in his house. A head was found in a paper bag that poor Deputy Fritz decided to look through. As he held up the head, a nearby cop said to him, quote, "By God, it's Mary Hogan." So, there she's at. Mm-hmm. More body parts were discovered, more lips, more breasts, more vaginas, noses, heads, everything. A steaming burlap sack had been found, so I'm assuming it must have been cold that night, and inside that steaming sack was the head of Mrs. Warden. What Ed had done to her head was cruel and humiliating. So he had put nails through her ears, like through both his ears, and then he connected those nails with a piece of twine so he could like hang it on the wall. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense the way I described it?
Yes.
There were so many pieces of body parts that the investigators really had no idea how many bodies or victims there were at this point. When the investigators found the rooms of Ed's mothers, they were shocked, not because of more atrocities, but because of their cleanliness and the nice furniture, the clothes being put away. And besides a layer of dust, I mean, they could just tell that the rooms had been undisturbed for years. So that was like the only thing that was dirty in there was dust, because no one had been in there. Right. So all of this had been discovered within 12 hours of Mrs. Warden's son realizing her mother was missing. His mother was missing. Sorry, Courtney.
I mean, that is a lot, and all of it is deeply disturbing. And I think it shows just how disturbed Ed's thinking was at this time. And, what can happen when severe mental illness is left to ruminate in isolation. I mean, I want to be very clear. The vast majority of people with mental illness and schizophrenia are not dangerous or violent and do not commit the same atrocities like Ed did. But this is, I think, an extreme example of...
Extreme mental illness coupled with extreme isolation,
Right.
you know, and being left to his own devices.
Right. Along with a fascination with...
The morbid.
Exactly.
The macabre.
Right.
Macabre. Well, that's where we're going to stop today. I believe that's pretty much it as far as the first day of and finding shit in his house.
Right.
They discover more things later on, but
when it's light outside.
Right. And then when they, you know, they only got to figure out who all these people are.
Right.
Did he murder them?
There are at least 9 because there are 9 masks and 9 vulvas.
Right. And like, where do they all come from?
Yeah, exactly.
So, did he murder them? Did he dig them up? Did he do both? That's what we'll
find out.
Figure it out, or we'll try to figure out, because, you know, he's so very, very different. His mental illness is very different than most of the ones that we deal with.
Right. Yeah, and I imagine he didn't always necessarily remember how he got some of the things or who they were.
Right. Okay, well, anything else you want to say before we wrap up for the day?
No, I think it's an ominous place to end.
All right. Dun, dun, dun. All right, everyone, stay safe. See you next Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye.